All throughout the late 1800s and the early 1900s, newspapers across America ran story after story of an astonishing phenomenon, the discovery of giant human skeletons. From California to Ohio, people claimed to have unearthed enormous bones, often measuring upwards of 7 to 9 feet in length. These skeletons didn't just appear in rural fields or hidden caves. They were found in places steeped in myth, mystery, and ancient history, sparking curiosity and speculation across the nation. One of the most famous accounts came from the Grand Canyon, a place already shrouded in mystery and Native American lore. In 1909, the Arizona Gazette reported that an explorer named G.E. Kincaid, supposedly under the Smithsonian Institution's sponsorship, had found a hidden cave system containing not only giant bones, but also relics that bore a striking resemblance to ancient Egyptian artifacts. The article described underground passages filled with statues, mummies, and hieroglyphic engravings, bizarre for a desert landscape thousands of miles from Egypt. Kincaid's account noted that the structures within the cave bore the names and likenesses of Egyptian gods, suggesting that these caverns were more than just burial sites. They were temples, possibly belonging to a civilization lost to time. The Kincaid discovery became an instant legend, though it quickly vanished from headlines, raising suspicions of a cover-up. Many believe that these findings were suppressed, as they posed uncomfortable questions about America's ancient past, and possibly conflicted with dominant archaeological narratives. For those who believe this story, this cover-up wasn't merely academic. It was intentional, meant to conceal a lost history. Beyond the Grand Canyon, giant bones were reported worldwide, further fueling the theory that these giants were part of an ancient, sophisticated culture. Possibly the mound builders, an enigmatic civilization that left earthen structures across the Midwest. Though skeptics were quick to dismiss the findings as either misinterpretations or hoaxes, the accounts continued to surface, each adding to the growing legend of America's giants. Some theorize that these artifacts and bones belonged to a lost race of giants whose existence was erased from mainstream historical records for reasons still unknown. The more these stories appeared, the more they began to weave a larger narrative. Were these giants remnants of the Nephilim, the fallen ones mentioned in Genesis 6:4, described as beings of enormous size and strength? This biblical connection provided a spiritual dimension to the mystery, as people questioned whether these giants were the offspring of the sons of God. If so, why had they resurfaced in America, and why was their existence seemingly obscured? To answer this question, I sat down with author and filmmaker Timothy Alberino in order to find out what's really going on.
We should be careful with some of the accounts that come out of the newspapers at the turn of the century, the late 1800s, early 1900s. There was a lot of embellishment. There was a lot of hyperbole in the papers. The periodicals were in competition, and so they would often publish sensational stories to try and captivate the audience. So it was not uncommon to have all kinds of fanciful stories being reported as legitimate news stories. Having said that, there's no way that all of the stories related to the bones of giants that appeared in those periodicals are all false. There's definitely, in my estimation, there's definitely truth to the idea that the bones of giants were being discovered in the mounds of America. I think that it's the most logical conclusion to draw when you look at all the evidence, when you look at the abundance of stories that were appearing at the turn of the century. Abraham Lincoln, of course, famously mentions the bones of that ancient race of giants that are buried in the mounds of America, something to that effect. And Colonel Powell, who was the director of the Smithsonian Institution, in a correspondence with a colleague of his, was remarking about the bones of giants being discovered in America. And he said that we cannot yet discuss, basically, and this is paraphrasing, we can't discuss this topic of giants until we can determine where they came from, because he was most interested and most concerned with the anthropologic doctrine of isolationism, and that was why he was hesitant to talk about the giants, because according to my research, the giants came from the Middle East primarily, the giants that were in America, the red-haired giants that the Indians talk about, and indeed some of the accounts of the bones of giants being discovered in the mounds in various parts of America, especially in the Midwest. Those giants, there was evidence that they had red hair, and that they were dressed in some cases, they were dressed in various kinds of armor, and were discovered with artifacts that were reminiscent of Middle Eastern artifacts. So Colonel Powell's problem, who was the director of the Smithsonian Institution, his problem was not so much that the bones of giants were being discovered, but that apparently they had arrived to the United States from foreign shores, which again contradicted the doctrine of isolationism. There was one particular article that told the story of one Professor Kincaid who discovered Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon, and there's no way to know if that story is true or if it was just a fanciful attempt by the newspaper to regale their readers with this incredible story. So I think that there is something in the Grand Canyon. I'm not sure what it is, but the Grand Canyon is an area that is very bizarrely guarded. There are parts of it that are off limits, not just because of geological concerns, but there's something else going on there as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if any of those stories about Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon can be verified or have been verified. Again, I'm cautious when dealing with those stories that came from the newspapers at the turn of the century. But at the same time, I would not discount the notion that you could find Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon. I think that the ancients were crossing the oceans much earlier than we think. I would say undoubtedly the Phoenicians were, and it wouldn't surprise me if the Egyptians were, but undoubtedly the Phoenicians. So I would expect to find Phoenician artifacts, and indeed I believe Phoenician artifacts have been found in America.
In my opinion, this is a telltale sign of being a Tophet. Tophet was a sacrificial altar of the Phoenician people. This bowl is about the same size as an infant child would be.
So you think this was used for ritual sacrifice of babies?
I think it's indicative of child sacrifice on the banks of the Chicago River thousands of years ago.
There are sites where you have a Phoenician or Proto-Phoenician script, for example, that have been discovered. At American Stonehenge, L.A. Marsuli discovered this. Well, he highlighted this in one of his films, that there were Phoenician, some sort of a Phoenician or Proto-Phoenician script discovered at that site. And if that's true, and I believe it is, then that is definitive evidence that the Phoenicians were here in the ancient past. And if the Phoenicians could make it, then it's also possible that the Egyptians could as well. The Phoenicians were the better mariners. They were, in fact, the builders, the boat builders for the Egyptian fleet, and they were the master mariners. The Phoenicians could have had all kinds of artifacts that they carried with them because they were traders. So they would stop at all of the major ports on their journeys and engage in trade. And among the Phoenicians, I believe that among the regular-sized Phoenicians were giants, were individuals of extraordinary stature. The Phoenicians certainly had a cult of giant worship, and I believe that they had some descendants of the Nephilim or the Anakim among them, because they were essentially Canaanites. And indeed, the Greeks called the Canaanites Phoenician. That's where we get the term. So the Phoenicians were obviously a seafaring people, and we know that the Philistines were a seafaring people. There could be some crossover there. And the Philistines, among the Philistines was Goliath of Gath, the most famous giant in the Bible who David slew. And so there's ample evidence that there were giants among the Phoenicians, and that the Phoenicians, traveling all around the world, were in a sense depositing these descendants of the Nephilim on different continents, including North America. I believe that the key to understanding the dispersion of the Nephilim all across the earth is the Phoenicians. They definitely had a presence a very prominent presence on the island of Sardinia. And in fact, I would say that even in a more Canaanitish Proto-Phoenician culture inhabited Sardinia first. And among this culture were people of extraordinary stature, giants. And others who have investigated, some investigators in the 1800s and early 1900s drew the same conclusion, that there are many indications that Canaanitish giants inhabited the island of Sardinia. I myself conducted 2 separate investigations on the island and interviewed multiple witnesses, mostly elderly people who were living and who grew up during a time when the government was still concealing the bones of giants. Not just concealing them. When I say the government, I mean the provincial government in Sardinia, and also the University of Cagliari, the capital city of Cagliari in Sardinia, seems to have been involved in not only covering up and concealing the existence of giants, but confiscating the relics, the artifacts, the bones of giants on the island of Sardinia. And these witnesses were not conveying to me hearsay. They were telling me stories about digging up the bones and bodies of giants themselves. And these are not, lest anyone think that these people are confusing these bones with giant sloths or mammoths or dinosaurs. The reason why this was so popular in Sardinia, the stories of people digging up the bones of giants, was because people were actively looking for the bones of giants, because oftentimes you could find bracelets and necklaces and rings on the deceased bodies of these gigantic individuals. And so people were obviously wanting to, they were treasure hunting. They wanted to harvest the valuables from these bodies because they were so often associated with riches, with jewels, with various kinds of ornaments, even earrings. And obviously, mammoths and giant sloths and dinosaurs were not in the habit of wearing jewelry. And I interviewed dozens of people who discovered the bodies of giants in different circumstances. Some people were just plowing in their field. Others were digging the foundations of their basements. Others were officially employed by the government to dig up artifacts related to the Nuragic civilization, the ancient Nuragic civilization, and working around the Nuragi towers. And were in the course of excavating some of these sites, we're discovering entire skeletons of giants. And we're talking anywhere from 7.5 to 12 foot to 15 foot tall. So we're not just talking about 6.5 foot tall people. And most of the accounts were much larger than 7 foot. Most of the accounts were 8, 9, 10 foot giants, all the way up to 15. And they were explicit. The stories are there's just way too many eyewitness accounts, way too many people who have held the bones of giants in their hands, way too many people who have opened sarcophagi of giants in Sardinia to discount this as mere fables, folklore. And again, I interviewed individuals who took the rings off of the fingers, the gigantic rings off of the gigantic fingers, and then later on, when the discovery came to light, individuals, agents from the government or from the university would show up to their house and forcibly confiscate all of the artifacts. So this was happening, by the way, this was happening in the early 20th century on the island of Sardinia. So all the way through the teens and the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, even up into the 50s, in Sardinia, people were routinely discovering the skeletal remains of gigantic humanoids. And so if you interview, especially the elderly people in Sardinia, you will discover that many of them, all of them, remember when the bones of giants were being routinely discovered and confiscated. But some of them will tell you stories of their own encounters with such artifacts. And again, I interviewed a handful of these individuals who were in the employ of the government to excavate the relics of the Nuragic civilization, and among those relics were the skeletal remains of giants, most likely Canaanitish giants, the Rephaim. We're talking about the descendants of the Nephilim. We know that the land of Canaan was littered with clans of giants, especially in the hill country. There were the sons of the Anakim, who were themselves the descendants of the Nephilim. The Zamzumim, the Emim, various tribes, clans of giants inhabiting the hill country in Canaan. And these were the most formidable enemies that Joshua and the Israelites had to contend with in order to subdue the land, to conquer the land of Canaan. So, who knows how long these Canaanitish tribes, these giant clans, were inhabiting Canaan before the conquest. It could have been for thousands of years, could have been for hundreds of years. But certainly, this seems to have been, the land of Canaan seems to have been a veritable minefield of the descendants of the Nephilim after the flood. So they consolidated in this region. Now, it perhaps wasn't exclusively in the land of Canaan that these giant clans had settled, maybe all over the Mediterranean, but certainly the land of Canaan was perhaps ground zero for post-flood giants, the offspring of the Nephilim. And I would say that the land of Canaan and Sardinia, because Sardinia certainly to me appears to be one of the primary settlements of the descendants of the Nephilim in the post-Diluvian age. I think that the giants, certainly there was a mandate from heaven, according to the Bible, to extinguish, to annihilate the offspring of the Nephilim. This is, of course, the famous genocide that happened in Canaan during the conquest. And what most people don't realize is that those clans, the ones that God wanted the Hebrews to utterly annihilate, were in fact the descendants of the Nephilim. These were the clans that were intermingled with the Anakim and the offspring of what was left of the offspring of the Watchers in the post-flood world. So there's a reason why this genocide was directed at these clans in the hill country, precisely because they were the remnants of the hybrid species that were inhabiting the earth, still in the aftermath of the flood.
And isn't it interesting the way Hollywood is beating this drum about the return of the Titans? Thanos, the Mad Titan, Sam Worthington, who was in Clash of the Titans and Wrath of the Titans, starred in a movie last year, went straight to Netflix, called The Titan, and the new Godzilla movie, where they have rebranded them. They're no longer Mutos, which is what, monsters of unusual size or whatever. They rebranded them as the Titans, the original and rightful rulers of Earth. Because again, presenting them as Titans, the original and rightful rulers of the Earth. The Titans are still around. In fact, I argue in my book, Last Clash of the Titans, that they are somehow still influencing things on this earth, even though they are currently chained in the abyss. Revelation 9 says they're going to get out for 5.5 months at the end. When the Nephilim return, and we understand that the Nephilim, the spirits of the Nephilim that were destroyed in the days of Noah, in the flood, were barred entrance into the afterlife, into the netherworld, into heaven, basically condemned to roam the earth. That was the belief of the early church. That was the belief of the Jews in the time of Jesus and through all, the Old Testament period. It wasn't until Augustine in about the 5th century that belief went away. He also basically turned the church away from believing that the Nephilim had been created at all. Ezekiel, though, saw it. And this is the thing. God bless people like L.A. Marzulli who've been, teaching this for a long time. He's right. The Nephilim are returning. But I think Ezekiel 39 is a clue, but you got to understand the worldview of the prophets to understand what Ezekiel was writing. In Ezekiel 39, he's writing about the culmination of the war of Gog and Magog. And Gog was the Old Testament Antichrist figure, okay? He is the figure that John, in the book of Revelation, calls the Antichrist. That is the same war that culminates with the Battle of Armageddon, which is fought for the Har Moed, God's Mount of Assembly, which is Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Ezekiel says, God said that he will prepare a place in Israel for burial of Magog, the forces of Magog. The Valley of the Travelers east of the sea refers to east of the Dead Sea. And It will block the travelers. The key is understanding that travelers in the Old Testament concept, the Old Testament world, were spirits that would travel or cross over from one plane of existence to another. In other words, the realm of the dead to the land of the living. And the places where he identifies east of the Dead Sea are places that during the Exodus, the stations of the Exodus, refer to a couple of places that are named for these interactions with the spirit realm. One of the stops in the Exodus, one of the stations of the Exodus is called Ovoth, which means spirits of the dead. It's based on a root word Ov, which means medium. The medium of Endor that Saul went to see was the Ov of Endor. In fact, one of the giants killed by David's men, Ishbi, they condense the word. Ishbi Benab is how it looks to us in English. Ishbi Ben Ov. Ishbi, son of the necromancer, son of the medium. And he was of the descendants of the Rapha, the sons of the Rephaim. The Rephaim were these spirits that the Amorites, the Canaanites, believed were the spirits of the mighty men who were of old, the ancestors of their kings. They were called in Canaanite texts, called by scholars the Rephaim texts, written about the time of the judges, where these Rephaim were summoned through necromancy rituals to the tabernacle of El, Mount Hermon, where El, they believed, would speak words of revivification to resurrect these spirits that were called warriors of Baal. And in these texts, they're described as warriors. They mount their chariots and they travel first one day and then another. And at dawn of the third day, they arrive to be resurrected. Like Jesus, who went down and preached and proclaimed to the spirits in prison until dawn of the third day, when he arrived, except that he really was resurrected. And Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 39 says, this is where these travelers will be buried. Another one of the stops on in fact, the mountain where Moses was led by God to get his only view of the Holy Land, the Promised Land. Climb this mountain of the Avarim. In Hebrew, that means travelers. Mount Nebo is the mountain of the travelers. It's right there across from Jericho in the plains of Moab. And that's where this demonic army will fall. Now, I believe that the Nephilim will return. I believe they're going to be the demons who possess a human army. I think by this point, the restrainer will have been removed. The church will be removed. So I pray I'm right, that we won't be here for that day, because that's the day of Armageddon. And when this demonic army comes against Jerusalem to try to claim God's Mount of Assembly, just like Lucifer in Isaiah 14, I will establish my Mount of Assembly on Mount Zaphon, raise himself above the stars, the angels of God. On that day, when God personally takes the battlefield, which Ezekiel describes, the travelers will be destroyed. And interestingly, in that verse in Ezekiel 39, he says, then the world will know I am the Holy One in Israel. That phrase is similar to one that we see in the Old Testament many times. The Holy One of Israel. Ezekiel 39, after he destroys the Antichrist army in the Battle of Armageddon that ends the war of Gog and Magog, he becomes the Holy One in Israel because he's on the battlefield. So yes, that is when, the Nephilim have always been here. If they're the spirits of those who died in the flood, they've always been with us because demons have always been with us. But on that day, they will be inhabiting the bodies of I believe, this army that comes against Israel. It will literally be an army of the evil dead.
So there was this campaign of extermination against the giants that is evident in the Old Testament. David, of course, and his mighty men were contending with the offspring, with the remnant of the giants that existed in their neck of the woods, in Canaan, in the Levant. But I think also the giants probably were bred out over time. That genetic material, those genetic markers of the giants were bred out into the population over time. So you would have a successive generations of giants that were becoming more diminutive in stature, were becoming smaller and smaller as they were intermingling and their DNA was being mixed into the gene pool, until it was probably very rare to have in a particular community individuals of extraordinary stature, gigantic, in other words, 9, 10, 11, 12 feet tall. So it's just the natural process of interbreeding with regular-sized human beings would wash out that gene pool and would disseminate the genes of the giants through the general population. And so in that way, the giants would have gradually disappeared, unless you had an area on Earth where the genes of the giants could be conserved and there was a big enough population of giants to where they could interbreed and in that way preserve those genetic markers. Otherwise, they would have intermingled with the local populaces and gradually reduced in stature over time. As I said, successive generations would have had less and less of those genetic markers present in their genomes. That, I think, is what happened in the United States, here in America, North America rather. Whereas at one time you had giants who were living among the native people precisely because the Phoenicians had brought them over. I believe the Phoenicians were mining copper in the Great Lakes. And the Phoenicians were in the habit of establishing colonies wherever they went. And they were friendly colonies. The Phoenicians, their goal was to establish trade. And these colonies would intermingle with the populaces. And they would create permanent trading posts. So they would not be hostile in most cases to the local populations. They would want to integrate with them for the purpose of trade. And so if there were giants among the Phoenicians, these giants would have also integrated with the local populaces, i.e. the Native American tribes. And so you would have had essentially Native American giants after that integration took place and successive generations were born. And so I think that's why you find the bones of giants in the mounds, in the Indian mounds. And in the beginning, those giants would have probably been fair-skinned, red-haired or blonde-haired, humanoid. But after enough interbreeding, they would have looked more and more like Native Americans, right? So you would have a very interesting situation in which the genetic markers of the Nephilim were introduced into North America through the Phoenicians, interbreeding with the Native Americans. And that's not to say that the giants themselves were peaceful. The Native Americans they tell stories of the ferocity of the giants. Everyone's familiar with Lovelock Cave and the fact that the Indians there wanted to eliminate the red-haired giants inhabiting that cave precisely because they were hostile, they were aggressive. And they effectively destroyed that clan of giants by trapping them in that cave and killing them with smoke and fire. So the giants had they had a predisposition to violence, to hostility. There are even Native American legends that talk about the cannibalistic giants, that they were cannibals. So I'm not trying to say that all of the giants were just integrating with the native populace. Some of them certainly were, while others were probably just remaining hostile and feeding on the native populace, or forcibly taking their women and attempting to copulate with them, perhaps to some varying success, of course, depending on how large the giants were. So there's all kinds of scenarios in which we can envision the giants dispersing across the earth from ground zero, which would have been Canaan and Sardinia and the islands in the Mediterranean, I think, generally speaking. And if they're driven out of Canaan during the conquest, then they've got to find other places to live. And if they're being primarily disseminated through a seafaring people, namely the Phoenicians, then it sort of makes sense that you find the giants all over the earth, because they were distributed all over the earth through the trade activity of the Phoenicians. And I am absolutely unequivocally convinced that the Phoenicians were mining copper in the Great Lakes. We know it's a historical fact that the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa. They were the first to do so. But I believe they were crossing the seas. They had remarkable boats. The Phoenicians devised their boats in such a way that they could be disassembled and then reassembled very quickly. So almost like linking logs or Legos or something like this. The Phoenicians, they could arrive to the shores of a distant continent. They could disassemble their boats, carry the planks through the forest, over the landscape, and then reassemble the boats in the rivers, in the waterways. And if we think about in terms of North America, they could have arrived to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They could have taken their boats as far as they could get down the water wave. When they encountered an impediment such as Niagara Falls, they could disassemble their boats, carry the planks over land, reassemble the boats in the waterways, and make their way to the Great Lakes. Right? And so the Phoenicians were remarkable boat builders. They were remarkable craftsmen. In fact, I believe that the Phoenicians were the only post-flood culture that could still build megaliths. And they did so on the island of Sardinia, although not to the same grandeur as the antediluvian civilizations, but yet they held the knowledge. They vouchsafed the knowledge. They were the keepers of secret knowledge. Indeed, the Phoenicians were, in effect, a secret society. And modern masonry, Freemasonry, is derived from the mysteries of the Phoenicians. Who was Hiram Abiff? Hiram Abiff, who was basically the founder of the Masonic order. The Masons will say maybe that Solomon, or perhaps even go all the way back to Tubal-Cain or Enoch, or maybe perhaps Nimrod as the founder of their society, of their fraternity. But if you look at the lore of the Masons, you're going to discover that Hiram Abiff is really regarded as the founder. And Hiram Abiff, according to legend, was hired by Solomon to help them build the temple. Indeed, it was King Hiram who was a good friend of Solomon's, who Solomon employed, and all of King Hiram's artisans to build the temple. Who was Hiram? We're talking about the king of Sidon and Tyre. He was a Phoenician king. So Hiram was the king of the Phoenicians. And these were the master masons. These were the master artisans of the ancient world, and they were the master mariners, and they were their alphabetical system is the foundation of our own. That's why we call it phonics, because it comes from Phoenician, because it was the Phoenicians who created the alphabetic system that we use today, the base of it, the foundation of it, which we've elaborated on, the Greeks and the Romans and so forth. We've all elaborated on that system, but the Phoenicians were remarkable. And there's very little known about the Phoenicians, even though they were probably the most remarkable ancient civilization in regard to their great knowledge, even more so than the Egyptians, as it pertains to their ability in masonry and boat making and so forth. Remember, it was the cedars of Lebanon, the planks that were used in the great temples in the Levant and in the Fertile Crescent in Egypt. The wooden planks of their temples and their great boats, all of everything that was made. I shouldn't say everything. Much of what was made out of wood for the royal palaces and the great temples came from Lebanon, from the cedars of Lebanon. And those cedars were delivered by the Phoenicians and worked by the Phoenicians, the master craftsmen, the master masons, the master mariners, the master navigators of the ancient world. So I believe that the Phoenicians were harboring secret knowledge that they somehow were able to conserve, that was either given to them or they discovered from the pre-flood world. I don't think that the Phoenicians brought the language from the pre-flood world. I think that they were a secret society. The whole civilization was like a secret society. Very little is known about it today, but they were essential. If you want to understand the ancient world, truly understand it, especially in regard to trade, then you have to be familiar with the Phoenicians. You have to familiarize yourself with the Phoenicians, because they are coming in and out of all these different cultures all the time, and everyone's talking about them. The Greeks were talking about them. The The ancient Egyptians were talking about them. The Persians were interacting with them. Everybody was interacting with the Phoenicians. Of course, the Hebrews were interacting with the Phoenicians, sometimes on very friendly terms, like Solomon and King Hiram of Tyre, and sometimes there was hostility. But the Phoenicians are always an important element of what's happening in the ancient world, and yet we know almost nothing about them. We know a whole lot about the ancient Egyptians. We know a whole lot about the other Mesopotamian civilizations and the ancient Greeks and so forth, but we know very little, almost nothing about the Phoenicians. Of course, the most famous Phoenician that everyone is familiar with that they don't realize is Hannibal Barca, who was the greatest enemy that Rome had ever seen. The greatest enemy with whom Rome had ever contended was Hannibal. And where was he from? Carthage. Carthage was in North Africa, and Carthage was a Phoenician settlement. They were Phoenician. And the Romans were appalled by the Phoenicians precisely because the Phoenicians were in the habit of sacrificing their children to idols, to Baal, and the other Phoenician gods. And they would sacrifice their children in the most heinous way, and the Romans were incensed by this. This is one of the reasons why the Romans hated the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians came very close to destroying Rome through Hannibal. These were remarkable people, and almost nothing is known of them, even though they were, in my estimation, sailing their remarkable ships to the shores of many different continents. I get the sense, and I know this is conspiratorial, but I get the sense that there's somewhat of a conspiracy revolving around the Phoenicians. I think the Phoenicians were in possession of knowledge and artifacts that would, to some extent, should they come to light, rewrite history. Artifacts from the antediluvian world. And part of those artifacts would be the genetic stock of the Nephilim, the descendants of the Nephilim, who were certainly in their midst. Mount Hermon has always been considered by these ancient Near Eastern cultures, and even by the Romans and the Greeks, to be what we would call today an axis mundi, a gateway to another realm, or perhaps a portal to somewhere else, right? It's a cosmic mountain. This is the way that the Mesopotamians would have viewed Mount Hermon. It's a cosmic mountain. And so it was believed that there was a gate there to the netherworld. And part of this lore revolves around the Enochian tale. And I say part of it because the Greeks had their own reasons for believing that, and the Canaanites had their own reasons for believing it, but obviously the Hebrews believed that because of the Enochian tale, that the Watchers descended here. And it's not coincidental that it was upon the slopes of Hermon that Jesus transfigured before his disciples. And it's not coincidental that it was at the base of Hermon where he declared that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. And he did this specifically at the site of the Grotto of Pan, which was thought to be an entrance into the netherworld or the underworld. So Mount Hermon is a cosmic mountain in the cosmology of the Mesopotamians and the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. It is a cosmic mountain. And again, what if that means something like a portal or a gate to hell or an axis mundi, whatever that means, it was viewed as this place where heaven and earth and the underworld were connected. That's what's known as an axis mundi. First Enoch relates an incredible story, a remarkable tale. And it turns out that this story lays the foundation for some of the most enigmatic references in the Old and New Testament of the Bible. So this isn't just some fanciful fiction that the Hebrews told their children at nighttime, some bedtime story. The story of First Enoch is foundational to Hebrew cosmology, to ancient Hebrew cosmology. You cannot remove the Enochian tale from ancient Hebrew cosmology. That's how foundational it is. And the story involves a company of 200 angels who the book of Enoch denominates watchers. And these angels were observing the daughters of men. And of course, this is the reference in Genesis 6. They were observing the daughters of men. They saw that they were comely, that they were fair, that they were beautiful. And they desired to take them as wives. In fact, their desire, there's two explicit things they desired, two things that are conspicuous and one thing that is inconspicuous. Two things that are directly mentioned, and the final motivation is inferred. So there's three motivations here. So the first thing we have to understand about the story of the Watchers is that there are three motivating factors that led to this transgression, which forms the beginning of the narrative, the historical narrative in the book of Enoch. And the first motivation is the Watchers desired to marry and copulate with the daughters of men. So they desired to wed these women and to impregnate them. The second desire was to progenerate through them their own offspring. They wanted to procreate and have children with their wives, with their human wives. That's the second motivation. The third motivation, and the first two are implicit, the third one is inferred. So the first two motivations are implicit in the text, in the narrative of 1st Enoch. This third motivation that I'm going to explain is inferred in what happens. And the third motivation is they wanted to usurp dominion of the earth from the sons of Adam through the agency of their hybrid offspring. That's the third motivation. And that is, as I said, not implicit in the text, it's inferred. So the Watchers, with these desires in mind, concocted this plan that they were going to descend to the earth in direct defiance of God. They knew that what they were about to do amounted to a grave transgression. And so what they did before they effectuated this plan was they bound themselves by an oath. And the book of Enoch says that they bound themselves by mutual imprecations, which means we're all in this together. We're binding ourselves together so that we will all have to pay the penalty for this great sin. So they bind themselves by mutual imprecations, and then they descend to the earth, and the point of arrival happens to be the summit of Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is in the Lebanese mountain range, in the Lebanon mountain range, and it is one of the highest peaks. And the Watchers descend to Hermon. It's not clear if they bind themselves by the oath before or after. I think they bind themselves by the oath actually when they arrive, because Mount Hermon was forever after known as the Mountain of Oath. So probably they bind themselves with an oath after they descend to Hermon. And as I said before, I do not envision the Watchers flapping their wings, descending, alighting onto the summit of Hermon with these big, bird wings. I think that they arrived at the helms of advanced aerospace vehicles. In other words, UFOs. So once they bind themselves by this oath, they descend into the plains and they begin to choose from among the daughters of men suitable wives. Each one chose a singular wife. And the sense isn't that they were invading the villages and throwing these women over their shoulders. This is not what's being communicated. Rather, the way I envision it, I think the way that's implied in the way it's implied in the text, is that the Watchers were covertly observing the villages and choosing each one of them which woman from these various villages that they wanted to take as a wife. And then a transaction occurs. And this is not exactly implicit in the text. This is also inferred in the text. The Watchers engage in a transaction with the fathers of the maidens that they want to wed. And remember, the motivation here is not just to copulate with these women, but rather to wed them, to take them as wives and procreate offspring with them, to have families, right? In the manner of the sons of Adam. And so the Watchers, once they have the maidens that they desire to wed, they go to their fathers and they make a transaction. And the transaction is something like Again, this is inferred in the text. The transaction is something like, I desire to wed your daughter, and here's what I'm going to give you as a dowry, as payment in exchange for your daughter's hand in marriage. And this is all being done in accordance with the customs of the ancient Near East. So the Watchers are engaging in the cultural norms here revolving around marriage, revolving around the covenant of marriage. And those norms involve something like a dowry, a payment for the daughter's hand in marriage. And this is a patriarchal society. So the fathers had the authority to give their daughters hands in marriage. The women really didn't have a say. Although I do believe that the women were willing participants, because they're later on judged for their transgression with the Watchers. So it's not that the Watchers are forcibly taking these women and demanding that the fathers give them their hands in marriage. Rather, there's a transaction happening here, a bargain. And it turns out it's a Faustian bargain. Because in exchange for their daughters' hands in marriage, the Watchers teach the sons of Adam, they teach the men, they instruct them in the knowledge that the men were already striving to learn. And what that informs us, that the Watchers already knew what kind of knowledge these men wanted. So they already came to the table with a bargaining chip in mind. You want to know X, Y, and Z, we can teach you these things, and in exchange, you give us your daughter's hands in marriage. So it's a transaction. And this is important because it's a legal transaction that the Watchers are after. This is a legal transaction with the rightful regents of the earth, the sons of Adam. And so the Watchers are obviously trying to accomplish something with legal cover. Otherwise, they would just have taken these women by force. They did not. They wed them. And you can envision the Watchers, and of course the Watchers are going to be received as the gods. The gods have descended, and you can imagine being a father of one of these maidens. This transcendent being, one of the gods, wants to marry my daughter and is going to give me as a dowry, is going to instruct me in the secrets of heaven. So it was a very favorable transaction for the sons of Adam. And again, I think specifically the sons of Cain, but that's just my hunch, let's say. So as the story goes, the Watchers wed the daughters of men, and we can imagine that this happened with all the pomp and ceremony and circumstance that such a wedding would have elicited. The gods are marrying these women, right? 200 Watchers. So this is probably a really big celebration. And then the Watchers begin to teach men the secrets, the knowledge they were striving to learn. In the meantime, as this is happening, the Watchers copulate with their wives. Their wives become pregnant, they conceive, and they give birth to giants. Some ancient texts suggest that some of the women's wombs were split open during birth, or were split open by the enormous size of the babies that are growing in their wombs. But I don't think that's really historically accurate, in as much as this is a historical narrative, because the women are later turned into sirens. They're later judged. So I think that most of them, and the Watchers, instruct their wives in the secrets, in these forbidden secrets. So the women are participating in the iniquity of the Watchers. They're not just giving birth and dying, apparently, according to the narrative. So I think that the women were giving birth to normal-sized babies, just like babies that are born with gigantism. And those babies, as they progress into toddlers and then into adolescence, experience an accelerated rate of growth. Again, just like babies who are born with gigantism. They're born at a normal size and rate, but it's like the valve is never shut off. That the puberty, the growth spurt never stops. They just keep going and going and going. But in the case of gigantism, it results in very large but weak human beings who have dysfunctional organs and who are usually not very athletic. Andre the Giant was an exception, and even he died young, the wrestler. But most people with gigantism do not live very long, in contrast to the offspring of the Watchers, who were superhumanly enhanced with the DNA of their angelic fathers. And so these would have been superheroes, basically, hybrids. They would have been human enough to appropriate, and this is important, the authority and dominion of the sons of Adam on earth, as given by God, that mandate, but yet at the same time, they were infused with the remarkable genetic markers and capabilities of their angelic fathers. And they grew to great stature, according to the book of Enoch. They began to consume all of the acquisitions of the land. In other words, they were eating all the food. And human beings were forced to feed the giants, according to Enoch. And when they could no longer sustain them, their appetites, the giants began to feed on men. And as all of this is unfolding, mankind is through the knowledge of the Watchers, they're developing various kinds of technology, including implements of war. Azazel, specifically the Watcher Azazel, taught men how to forge weapons and make armaments of war. And this is proliferating all kinds of bloodshed on the earth. So there's a murderous bloodlust that is introduced through the knowledge of the Watchers that had not previously existed in the world. So the knowledge of the Watchers is corrupting mankind, and they're becoming murderous and bloodthirsty and are becoming very idolatrous and altogether wicked, so that by the time the flood comes, their thoughts are only evil continually, as the Bible says. And so eventually there's so much chaos and havoc and death and war unfolding in the earth that men began to cry out to God, to petition heaven. And their petitions are brought before the King of Heaven. The angels bring their petitions to the King of Heaven. And it is decided that the good Watchers, by the way, the divine council is apparent in 1st Enoch, because you have the good Watchers in heaven and you have the apostate Watchers on earth, the defected Watchers on earth, and you have the good ones in heaven. And these are the good ones are referred to as the holy Watchers of heaven. This terminology, holy Watchers, is also apparent in the book of Daniel. And so this is effectively members of the divine council. This is the council of the king. And the prayers and the petitions of the people who are dying and suffering on earth, who are living in this nightmarish dystopia on planet Earth, their petitions are coming before this council and before the king. And the king decides, the king and his council, decide that they're going to put a stop to the activity of the Watchers on the earth. And what happens is this judgment comes forth, this very, very punitive judgment comes forth, in which the Watchers are to be bound in chains. And their offspring are going to be destroyed before a cataclysm destroys the earth. And so the Watchers are bound in chains. God dispatches some of the good guys to come and bind them in chains. But before they're imprisoned in what Peter calls Tartarus in 2 Peter in the New Testament, directly referencing this story from 1st Enoch, before they're bound in chains in the abyss in Tartarus, they're forced to behold the annihilation, the destruction of their beloved sons. And so they have to watch as God incites the offspring of the Watchers into fratricide, into a civil war, a hybrid civil war in which they utterly annihilate each other. And this is part of the judgment of the Watchers. They have to watch their offspring, the Nephilim, the giants, go to war with one another. And I don't envision this as, big dumb giants clonking each other over the heads with clubs. This is a technological war. They're bringing into this conflict all of the technology and knowledge of their fathers, of the Watchers. They're bringing into battle the armaments forged from the knowledge of the Watchers. So I envision this much more like the ancient Sanskrit epics of India, in which you have these epic battles in which the gods and mortal men are locked in these bloody conflicts. And in the midst of these wars, you have these amazing advanced aerospace vehicles being deployed, which are called vimanas in the Sanskrit epics. And these vimanas are like warships, flying warships that are able to discharge what appears to be some sort of laser or missiles, and it's all described in lurid detail in Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And I think this is probably what this conflict between the offspring of the Watchers, the hybrid civil war that's unfolding between the various factions of giants on Earth looked like. It looked like superhuman giants and their advanced technology fighting each other, but in the midst of this battle are also human beings who are also fighting on one side or the other, just like the Sanskrit epics, right? So something like that, in my estimation, is unfolding in this fratricidal conflict that's unfolding on planet Earth before the flood. And so the Watchers are witnessing their offspring kill each other. And then, and this all happens as a prelude to the cataclysm of the flood, which is never actually described in the book of Enoch. But it's coming in the background. It's coming. But it's never actually described in the historical narrative. But that's pretty much what brings the narrative to an end, is God chooses to preserve the line of Adam through Noah and some of the animal life on Earth, and everything else is destroyed. According to the book of Enoch, the Watchers descended in the days of Jared. And they remained on the earth from Jared to Noah, to the flood of Noah. And depending how you calculate that, according to the Septuagint, you have something like 1,250 years. That's if you interpret that genealogy in a linear way, as a linear calculation of time. It's over 1,000 years from Jared to the flood. So that's over 1,000 years that the Watchers had to intermingle with the human species, and that their offspring had to grow and prosper and propagate and dominate the earth and build kingdoms. Because remember, I said that the third motivation of the Watchers was to usurp dominion of the earth through the agency of their hybrid offspring, who were human enough to claim that dominion, to appropriate the authority of Adam on earth. And so the Watchers were basically, the idea was to rule, to govern the earth from behind the thrones of their hybrid sons, who would become the kings. And indeed they did. They did become the kings, and this is inferred. But what else can you call it if the Watchers, if the giants are consuming all of the acquisitions of the land? In other words, everything is being brought to the giants. They're effectively dominating the human race. They're dominating the human populaces. And I think that is an intimation, an allusion to the fact that they are actually ruling over the kingdoms of men, and indeed establishing their own kingdoms. And I believe the Watchers did exactly what Plato says that the gods did, the gods of the Greek pantheon. Plato says in the Critias dialogue, Plato says that the gods they apportioned the earth amongst themselves. It's the first thing they did. And we know that Poseidon took for his allotment, he took Atlantis, the area of the region of Atlantis, and he established his kingdom. And then what does Poseidon do after he's allotted his portion? And then he establishes his kingdom, and then what does he do? He marries a human woman, Plato. He copulates with her, and she gives birth to 10 hybrid sons who become the 10, and they're twins, so 5 sets of twins. They become the 10 kings of Atlantis. And I think they were giants, and if we're to take that story literal, I think at the very least, that story is an allegory of the antediluvian world. And so I think the Watchers did the very same thing. They allotted the earth among themselves, and they established what I call the empire of the gods, because it's effectively an empire. And each of these Watchers, their hybrid sons would have governed, would have been the kings of their respective realm. And this might have gone all over the world. And so you would have had, in my estimation, you would have had the gods walking among men, the Watchers, who were venerated as such, as gods, and temples were raised to them. And rather than there being just some idol to them, they would actually be sitting there receiving the adulation of their human subjects in these temples. And their sons, their hybrid sons, would be the kings, literally governing over the kingdoms. And I think we could expect that these would have been quite advanced, at least the knowledge that the Watchers had, that extraterrestrial advanced knowledge would have been deployed and employed in their kingdoms, but not to the commoner. I think that the common people would have been something like a Bronze Age civilization, and that fraternity of hybrid giants would have had advanced knowledge and technology, much like the movie Stargate, in which you have this advanced alien being who is masquerading as Ra, as the god Amun-Ra, with advanced technology, and his guards have these advanced flying machines, aerospace vehicles, and advanced staffs that shoot out projectiles. But the rest of the populace is like a Bronze Age Egyptian populace. I think something like that is an accurate view of the antediluvian world. So you have this fraternity of hybrid giants in possession of advanced technology and knowledge, but only them and their moms and their fathers, right? So this is what I call the empire of the gods. And you can imagine when those kingdoms go to war, what that would look like. Maybe even atomic level armaments, like nuclear type technology, but those type of weapons were deployed and wrought great destruction on the earth. And maybe this is why, by the way, why do we not find evidence of these advanced civilizations? Because they annihilated themselves. How much evidence would you find of our civilization in 10,000 years from now if we had utterly annihilated ourselves with nuclear missiles? What kind of evidence would remain if we experience a nuclear holocaust? And I'm not saying a bomb drops here and there. I'm saying every single major city is obliterated, right? Because that's the kind of war I think was happening. And then a global cataclysm washes all the debris away in the aftermath. And much of what happens here to the matter, to the material, to the structures, the buildings, the edifices, they're vaporized, they're melted. Explosive devices that we can't even, the destruction of which is beyond our imagination right now. Many times more, like an antimatter bomb is many times more destructive than a nuclear warhead, decimating, annihilating, vaporizing these kingdoms, these hybrid kingdoms, these kingdoms that are being governed by the offspring of the Watchers. The Nephilim kingdoms are being vaporized in a technological war using unimaginably destructive technologies. And then an unimaginably destructive cataclysm ensues in the aftermath. How much of that civilization should you expect to find 10,000 years later? The answer? Almost nothing. That's the answer. Almost nothing would be the answer. So I think that would be one reason why we don't find much evidence of an advanced ancient civilization because they literally obliterated themselves, right? And I believe that the cataclysm, the specific cataclysm that ensued, in my estimation, I could be wrong about this is my opinion, is what is known as the Younger Dryas Impact event. And basically, the Younger Dryas Impact event happened at the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, roughly. And it resulted from fragments of a comet breaking up in the atmosphere or an orbit around the Earth and pummeling the North American ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet, North America, for example, which covered most of North America at the end of the last ice age, was a mile to a couple miles deep in certain areas. And this is ice. This is solid ice. This is water, fresh water in the form of ice. And when those fragments of this comet impact, each one of them is itself many times more explosive in destruction than an atomic bomb. And so it generates, it vaporizes everything in the impact zone, right, at ground zero, vaporizes everything, and suddenly melts the ice sheets. And so imagine all of that fresh water, millions of cubic tons of fresh water pouring into the ocean. It would be tidal waves sweeping across the land masses, and not just in North America. And then in concert with this, you have the I think they call it the ejectile or the ejecta, the ejecta, I think it's called, of the superheated fragments of that comet just blasting off hundreds of miles away, landing in forests and just lighting them on fire. So you have extensive biomass burning all over the globe. At the same time, the sheets of ice are melting. It would have caused earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tidal waves sweeping across the oceans. Utter destruction. The utter destruction it's just absolute utter destruction on every landmass on planet Earth. Every continent is experiencing cataclysmic destruction. Any kind of civilization that lives on the shore of the ocean or on the bank of a river, gone, obliterated. It would have been totally flooded, tidal waves washing it away, and ultimately the sea levels rose dramatically. And so this all in the wake, potentially, of a catastrophic, let's call it, nuclear holocaust, right? Probably something even more destructive than nuclear, and a different kind of technology. So envision that. You have what would amount to a nuclear holocaust, followed by the Younger Dryas Impact event. The Earth being bombarded at the end of the last ice age with these fragments of this comet, precipitating all of the calamitous things I just described, and more, by the way, and more, because it would be followed by a nuclear winter of sorts, which would blot out the sun, all of that debris going up in the atmosphere, blotting out the sun for an extended period of time. What survives this? Only Noah and his family, basically, through the providence of God. Now, do other things survive? Potentially. But we know that Noah and his family were providentially delivered, carried through this cataclysm. So you can see my perspective of the antediluvian world is much different than you saw in your coloring books in Sunday school. And I believe that this is much of this story that I told from Enoch. A lot of it is literally the text, what's written, but then I have also what's inferred. I've been communicating what's inferred or intimated, and I think this gives us an insight into the antediluvian world. So in the wake of such utter destruction, what would you expect to find on Earth? What remnants of these events, of this antediluvian civilization, would you expect to find? Only the megalithic foundations. That would be all that was left, the megalithic foundations. And that is precisely what we find all around the world. We find these massive megalithic constructions, edifices, that defy modern engineering capabilities in some cases, and that employ a level of masonry that is in some cases unrivaled on Earth, such as the walls of Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo in Peru. Ollantaytambo, the masonry represented in Ollantaytambo with these massive megalithic blocks is unparalleled anywhere in the modern world. We cannot duplicate it. And it's represented in Egypt. It's represented to some degree in the Sphinx itself, which I think are very, very old. And it's represented in Baalbek, this antediluvian architecture, these megalithic foundations. Again, the only thing you should expect to find after a catastrophic war followed by a world-ending cataclysm. A catastrophic nuclear-type war followed by a world-ending global cataclysm. The big question on everybody's mind that I'm always asked is, how do you have Nephilim in the post-Diluvian world? How are there Nephilim giants still alive, and not just the spirits of the giants, the demons, but actual giants still roaming the earth after the flood? That's the question that everybody wonders. And the answer to that question depends on how you view the flood. For one thing, there are several theories. The Bible is not explicit about this situation, about how we have post-flood Nephilim in the world. It doesn't explicitly tell us. So I think we have to make some guesses, some logical inferences. As I said, it all depends on how you view the flood. There are three ways you can view the flood of Noah. And contrary to popular belief, all three are plausible within the biblical text. In other words, all three can be argued from the text, from just the text in Genesis. The first view is the most common, the most popular, which is a global flood. When I say global flood, what I mean is every square inch of land on planet Earth is underwater. That means the top of Mount Everest is underwater. That's the global flood. That's the one that most Christians are familiar with and assume is the correct biblical interpretation of the flood. The second proposition is what's known as a local flood. And the local flood theory proposes that there was a catastrophic flood, but it was localized to the Fertile Crescent area. That the known world to the biblical writers at the time, i.e. Mesopotamia, was completely and utterly flooded. So that all of the mountaintops that they could see, or the hills that they could see in their local region, were utterly flooded. That is the local flood theory. The third proposition is one that I think I've invented. I've never heard anyone else propose it, but it's a middle ground between those two, between the two former theories. And I call this a global cataclysm, a flood that resulted, or rather, a flood that was a cataclysm in which there was catastrophic flooding all over the earth, but not necessarily covering every square inch of water, and not just localized to one region of the earth. So that would be sort of in between the global flood and the local flood. Again, what I call a global cataclysm. And I say cataclysm because the flood, in my view, a flood, in this particular view, are only one aspect of the cataclysm, because it would all depend on where you live. You would have, as I said before, if it was the Younger Dryas impact, that is the source of the Noahic flood, then you would have all sorts of calamitous things unfolding on the earth. If you lived in the impact zone, then you're vaporized. If you live underneath those sheets of ice, in other words, if you live further south, then you're going to be washed away by a tidal wave from all that water rushing down to the ocean. If you live in a heavily forested area that is affected by the ejecta, this molten ejecta from the impact, then you're going to be consumed in massive wildfires. If you live near fault lines, you're going to experience devastating earthquakes. So everybody is experiencing the cataclysm. If you live on a coastal region, on a river or lake, you're going to be underwater. If you're living in proximity to the ocean or a river, you're going to be underwater, right? So that's why I call it a global cataclysm. And most people just think in terms of a flood. I'm thinking in terms of something much more dynamic and destructive than just water. And I believe every continent was experiencing catastrophic flooding, but not necessarily that every square inch of ground was under the water. And again, people are going to immediately protest and say, but doesn't the Bible say X, Y, and Z? My answer, it depends. There are plenty of scholars who make a good hermeneutical argument for a local flood using the same words in Hebrew and with a very logical position on what those words are conveying. I would say just as convincing as anyone making an argument for the global flood. And that's important to keep in mind. Just because you haven't been exposed to that scholarship doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And a lot of people get very angry about this because they assume that there's only one way to interpret certain texts, certain events. It's just not true. It's just not true. And again, there's a lot of good scholarship arguing for a local flood. And if a local flood is possible, then a global cataclysm is possible. So those are the three options, and there may be more. You have the global flood, every square inch underwater. You have a local flood, a localized catastrophic flooding event, and then you have a global cataclysm, every square inch of the earth affected by cataclysm, but in different ways. Now, in the global flood scenario, you only have a possibility for survival on the ark, unless you're a fish, right? So all of the land creatures would be drowned, except for those that are on the ark. In a local flood scenario, then you have the profusion of life on earth, most of it being unaffected, and only that region, that particular region being catastrophically affected by that cataclysm, by the flood. Still saving those individuals who are on the ark, because that's where they were living, and still being delivered through that flood in the manner that the Bible describes. And in the same way, if you have a global cataclysm, then you have opportunity for survival as well, outside of the ark. And again, everyone always immediately accuses me and others of denying the plain reading of the scriptures. It's just not so. That's not the case. You are reading an English you're reading an English translation of a particular interpretation. It's not the only interpretation in regard to the flood. And so it's simply, when people get up in arms about this, it's just a manifestation of ignorance. So I personally lean toward a global cataclysm. However, I'm perfectly willing to accept a global flood or a local flood. I'm open to all three possibilities. All three propositions are on the table, but I lean in the direction of a global cataclysm. So you can see now, depending on which of these options you choose, it will bear upon regarding how the Nephilim made it through the flood into the post-diluvian world, into the post-flood world. Now, if you subscribe to a global flood, then you're really limited. The Nephilim would have had to do one of two things. They would have had to have some extraordinary way of surviving, like going underground maybe. The other option, which is probably, perhaps, I would say at least equally plausible, is the genes of the giants. The DNA of the giants were carried through the flood in the genomes of Noah's sons' wives, or one of them. Specifically Ham's wife, probably, based on what unfolds after the flood. And so that's a popular theory, that genetic stock, so to speak, that DNA information of the Nephilim came through the flood, literally carried in the genome of, let's say, Ham's wife, right? That's possible. I'm certainly open to that idea. Okay, so if you subscribe to a local flood, then the question is moot. Because if you weren't inhabiting that specific area that was flooded, then you would not have been eliminated, annihilated. And the same can be said of the global cataclysm hypothesis. So take your pick. I mean, or there may be other options. Now, one option that I reject is the notion of a second incursion. It's often referred to as the second incursion. And the second incursion proposes that it happened again. The Genesis 6 type transgression, that the Genesis 6 affair happened again. So it seems like a very simple explanation for a lot of people. How do we get giants in the post-flood world? Angels did it again. They came down, they copulated with human women, and the same thing happened. I don't think so. Why don't I think so? Because the first event is so well attested, so instrumental, so fundamental to Hebrew cosmology that it's unthinkable that the second incursion would be undocumented and nowhere mentioned. Anywhere. There is no mention of a second incursion anywhere. And the first one is so well documented, it's so important in the minds of the ancient Hebrews. To think that a second incursion would just be no big deal is ludicrous in my mind. So, and also the judgment on the watchers was so severe and apparent to the rest of the angels that I think it was an effective deterrent. So I do not believe in a second incursion. There is no attestation anywhere, no textual attestation to a second incursion. You cannot find it anywhere within the Hebrew cosmological worldview. I don't even think that any such thing is suggested. I could be wrong about this, but I don't think anything like that is even suggested in the Second Temple tradition. And now people would say, well, didn't God intend to kill them all? So what, he failed? You cannot avoid the fact that the Nephilim appeared in the earth after the flood, one way or another.
Universal story agrees with the record of every major culture of the ancient world in which the astonishingly consistent story is told of gods that descended from heaven and or came through spiral vortices to materialize in bodies of flesh. From Rome to Greece, and before that to Egypt, Persia, Assyria, Babylonia, Sumer, the earliest records of civilization tell of the era when powerful beings known to the Hebrews as watchers, and in the book of Genesis as the B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, mingled themselves with humans, giving birth to part celestial, part terrestrial hybrids known as Nephilim. The Bible says this happened when men began to increase on earth and daughters were born to them, when the sons of God saw the women's beauty, and they took wives from among them to sire their unusual offspring. I believe a record of this is recorded in Genesis 6:4, when it says there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown.
A man named Denton's Productions walks alone, follows Christ and the path he's shown. in the night where shadows glow. Battles, demons, flesh and